Well, I see that we are streaming. So we are now on Zoom, we are on Facebook, everything works. So I can start with more formal introduction and we can kick this meeting off. All right, thank you very much to everyone who has joined us this evening. This is our regular workshop in social science called Соціологія показала, or Sociology has shown. Typically, we invite researchers from sociology or political science to share their work in progress or recently published papers to promote academic research. And usually these studies cover Eastern European region or post-communist societies. And I think that today we have a perfect guest, Dr. Gonorata Mazepus, who has published on our region quite widely. And today she will present, I think, the paper which soon will appear officially in the journal. Let me say a few words about our guest. So Dr. Gonorata Mazepus, she studied international relations at Adam Mickiewicz University. Then she also received her master's in social science methodology from the University of Bristol. And then she received her PhD from Leiden University, where she also works currently. She's assistant professor of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. And today, coincidentally, I talked with one of my colleagues who told me that she follows Gonorata on Twitter. So I can advise everyone who listens to us also to follow her account and learn about social science and research about our region. So Gonorata, we are very happy to host your presentation. The floor is yours. We're looking forward.
Thank you so much for such a nice introduction, Timothy. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm also welcoming everybody on this evening hour. I'm shocked that we actually have so many participants. I'm not used to a crowd mobilizing at an evening. So I think maybe one thing that I want to add to this introduction is that I have been a part of a project which was called EU-Strat, which actually studied the Eastern Partnership region with the focus on Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova at some point. And we were very much interested in trying to study the region from the perspective of the region, because very often what's happening is that we have just, some scholars that are writing about the region without actually having involvement of people, scholars, and expertise from the region. So there are several publications that might be interesting for you, because we've worked with NGOs, we've worked with think tanks from the region, and perhaps you even recognize some of the names there among the authors, because the idea was to have these voices also included in the publications. But today I'm going to talk about something else. This is the next stage of my research, and I also encourage you to ask questions or write down your questions. I would really like to have some space to discuss with you, and we can discuss this research agenda or any other academic issues that you are interested in and might have questions about. So I will start sharing my screen now, and hopefully everybody will be able to see it now. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Full screen.
Perfect. So we can start. So the idea for this presentation was to give you a kind of sneak preview into a paper that is currently in press with Comparative Political Studies. And I have worked on this paper together with Dmytrom Tошковim. He's also a scholar from Leiden University. And what I want to do in this presentation is not only to tell you about this paper, but about broader research agenda that I have that relates to it. And I will start by giving you a little bit of context about it. Then I will show you the main findings of the paper. And then I will also discuss the next steps, because that's just one paper, but the agenda, of course, develops further. And I have some preliminary results of the next steps. So the general question that I'm trying to tackle here is, do checks and balances actually matter to citizens? What we did actually within Leiden University, across different faculties, we tried to create a team, interdisciplinary team, that will study the checks and balances from the perspective of history, political science, political psychology, and with some anthropology in there. And I am more the political psychology and anthropology part of the team. And then we have a political scientist and a historian there. And this project is called Keeping the Powerful in Check, from Small Communities to Large States. So you can see already that there are some intriguing words in the title of the project. And we were lucky enough that we got funded with substantial support from the Leiden University Fund, which is a fund from the alumni of the university, right, who want to sponsor science and research. So that was our lucky strike that we can actually continue with this research agenda. And our main kind of contribution of this project that we have not seen so well developed in the literature so far is the role of the scale as a variable that explains what kind of checks and balances work and what kind of checks and balances do not work. And scale meaning the scale of society. So we ask a question, how does scale affect the performance of institutional checks and balances? And as I mentioned, we have this kind of interdisciplinary approach. And what we do is that I focus, for example, in one part of my project on anthropological records of hunter-gatherers and try to find out how did they keep the leaders of their small communities in check, what kind of mechanisms they used, what was the role of deliberation, for example, or what was the role of just putting someone down, how the decisions were made, etc. And this is still in the making. And the other side of my research is using survey experiments and other types of experiments to actually study individual perceptions. So the starting point is that we all have some kind of common intuitions as humans about checking the leaders, trying to control those who are in power. And those intuitions have been evolved throughout our human history, but they are now applied to a particular mass society context. And perhaps we have some mismatch there that needs to be addressed. So this is like the part of the project that I am working on. But we also look at the historical records and how the idea itself of trias politica and idea of the division, separation of power has been developed in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, and what kind of problems the contemporaries back then were dealing with when they were expanding the access to politics. And we also look across the regions. This is more from the political science perspective, how, for example, transplantation of particular Western political systems then works in practice in ex-colonies. Because what we know is that formally, many of the states across the world have pretty much copied or were forced to copy the models from either the British model or from other European colonies or American model. But we know that in practice, there is a big discrepancy between these formal institutions that were transplanted and how informal politics work, how actually politics works in these regions. So this is the broader research agenda that I am working on. And of course, something has inspired this research agenda. And one of the observations is that, around the globe, we have pretty high and robust pronounced democratic values. So if you run World Values Survey, if you ask people in general whether they support democracy and democratic institutions, they will purely say, yes, we are all for it. We want to have the voice. And most of the time, the differences are not so big between countries. Among those with high support for democratic institutions are hybrid regimes, are also authoritarian regimes. Russia, for example, is not far from what we have in the Netherlands. But we have increasing evidence that these democratic values are not running too deep. And even in those countries who are considered older democracies or older democracies. We have increasing evidence, for example, that backsliding happens also in the United States or countries in Western Europe. And ultimately, we have citizens allowing for dismantling of checks and balances. So you already probably understood that I come from Poland. So this topic is also very close to what is going on currently in Poland, but also in other parts of Europe, such as Hungary or Czech Republic, where checks and balances are being disturbed, altered, And there is pretty much a battle of how the political system should look like. So the main questions are, why do citizens allow the executives to abuse the power? Are the formal checks and balances not useful to citizens? Is there something wrong with their design, perhaps? Are they not working in the way that is actually useful for the citizens? And maybe do these problems result from some mismatch between citizens' individual psychology and modern mass-scale institutions? And this first paper that I want to talk to you about is just one kind of preview of one of the mechanisms that is behind it. So the paper is called Standing Up for Democracy, ? Explaining citizens' support for democratic checks and balances. And I co-authored it, as I said, with Dmytro Toshkov. And one of our first propositions is that why we observe this kind of backsliding or lack of support for checks and balances, perhaps just ignorance of checks and balances even, is because of our coalitional psychology. And this means that winners and losers of elections have different stakes in keeping the executives in check. So the losers of elections are actually those who are the most vulnerable to the abuse in case checks and balances are being changed by those who are in charge. So they should be the most protective of checks and balances. The other argument is that polarization at the individual level, so in terms of how strongly you feel about the party that wins elections, moderates the effect of losing and winning. So if you are not invested in the political game, it doesn't really matter, right? Then this effect will not change depending on whether you lose or win. But if you are really invested in the game, then this effect will be stronger. And this comes, of course, from a literature, so we do not kind of take it out of the thin air, but we build on the studies that have been there. And I think one of the classical studies that you might have come across is the Losers' Consent by Anderson and co-authors. They did show that support for democracy changes depending on whether you lose or win elections. So in this broad kind of terms, there is evidence from Latin America that supporters of the winning parties are more easily giving more powers, for example, to the presidents. And this actually the first paper on the slide from Graham and Spolik, but the newest paper listed here shows experimentally that also in the US, citizens trade off their checks and balances for partisanship or for policy outcomes. So this is the basis for our propositions there. And the other set of propositions has to do with trading of democratic checks and balances for policy outcomes, and specifically for economic policy outcomes. And here we kind of move the literature from more the authoritarian kind of regimes, where it is very often said, citizens in, let's say, Russia, and I also wrote a paper about that once, they are willing to trade off their freedoms, democratic rights for policy outcomes, because they actually, they sustain their lives. So therefore, this is what they care about. And then, they accept the abuse of power. But this is not always the same argument. No, this argument is not always used also for other regimes. So it's more commonly used in when discussing authoritarian or hybrid regimes. And then the other kind of sort of literature that links to that as well is legitimacy literature. So more psychological mechanisms that again explain why people care more about the outputs rather than procedures. And here the debate is still on, actually, whether people prefer the outcomes or procedures, and in which particular situations they are willing to trade off the fairness of procedure, for example, for personal gain. So this is another set of underlying studies that we draw on. And in our particular study, well, we actually conducted the study in two ways. The first one is an observational study, where we used the European Social Survey from 2012 to understand the support for checks and balances across the 26 countries that the data is collected in. And why we use this particular wave is that this battery of questions was asked just in that particular wave. So we did not have this data for other years. And in particular, we are interested in these questions that tap into the different checks and balances. And that is missing. So there is always a question about democracy in general, but the specific questions are not there. And the second study that we conducted was an experimental study to test the support for a reform of checks and balances. And this has been done with the data collected in Ukraine by InfoSapiens. This was the agency that helped us collect the data. And I was very happy with their services, just to let you know. So we derived a set of hypotheses for the observational study and a separate one for the experimental study. And I will talk you through one by one because I think it's just easier to follow if I first focus on the ESS data and then on the experiment. So for the observational study, the first hypothesis that citizens supporting the winning parties will assign less importance to democratic checks and balances, constraining the power of the government, than citizens supporting the losing parties. This is also pre-registered, by the way. So this phrasing is always the same as in our pre-registration documents. So even if our ideas changed later, we could not adjust the hypothesis, right? And the second sub-hypothesis there is that the effect of partisanship, so this is this polarization logic, on support for democratic checks and balances will be stronger for party supporters than for mere party voters. And then the economic one, satisfaction with the economy is associated with less importance assigned to democratic checks and balances, constraining the power of the executive. With the logic, well, they are delivering to us, why would we constrain them, right? And these are the results. And again, I will just try to talk you through it step by step. I don't know if everybody is fluent with interpreting regression coefficients, but they are always a little bit tricky when you look at them. So what you see here, and I think you can see my cursor, right? When I move it over the screen, yeah. So here on the left, you see the different checks and balances, starting with the importance of free elections. So this is actually this majoritarian check and balance. And then you have those that are actually constraining the power of the executive, which is that the courts can limit the government action. Then the third one is the media are free to criticize the government. And the last one here at the bottom is that opposition is free to criticize the government. And what you see is that, and I think I have to move something here around and then I will see it better. In blue, so the blue dots, you see the effect of being a supporter of a winning party on these different checks and balances here, by comparison to being the supporter of the losing party, which is indicated by the vertical gray line here, right? So already with the first effect, maybe that shows you what it means. The importance of elections, well, those who were supporting the winning party assign more importance to elections than those who were supporting the losing party here at the gray line. And obviously those who did not vote, which are indicated here by the red triangles, they don't care, well, they care the least of everybody, right? Well, they didn't vote, so they don't really care about elections. That makes sense, kind of intuitively. Then the interesting thing happens for the other checks and balances, because you see that it flips. So here again at the gray line, we have the support for the losing party and its effect on the support, well, or assigning importance to courts limiting the government's power. And here you see this effect for the voters for the winning parties. So the difference is in this direction, right? You see that those who won the elections and supported that winning party, they are less concerned with courts limiting the government action than those who lost the election. And the same is actually for the other two checks and balances, so the media and the opposition. And interestingly, when you trace these effects here, you see that those who did not vote are very close to those who voted for the winning party, right? So they cluster kind of together. Here there is a slightly bigger difference, but still the confidence intervals overlap. So actually what we see is that the biggest difference is between those who supported the losing party and everybody else. So the losers are here the ones that stand out the most in the pattern. These effect sizes are not huge, but still, when you think about it, it is quite significant that it happens across countries. Now, let's move to the next slide, where I will make the story even more complicated. But I hope you can still follow what I'm trying to say. We actually find quite big country heterogeneity. So these effects are either bigger or larger, and sometimes even close to zero, because here on this side, you see the overlap of confidence intervals with zero, depending on the country. So I showed you before the average effects in the pooled sample, and here this is a graph that shows you country-specific effects of supporting a winning party compared to supporting a losing party on the perceived importance of the media to criticize the government. And then for all the democracies, the coefficients are marked in blue. And for new democracies and Russia, they are in red. The solid horizontal gray line is the average effect here. So you see that, in Spain, you have the effect over here. And then in France, on the other side, you have the effect on completely different level. What we see here also immediately is that actually these countries don't cluster along the new versus old lines, right? So they're all mixed up. So that's one of the potential explanations that we explored. Why do we see this heterogeneity? And we think, well, already on the basis of this graph, that the age of democracy doesn't matter, and we tested for it as well. So it's not that new versus old democracies differ in this effects of losing and winning on the acceptance of or importance of checks and balances. We also tested for the polarization at the system level. So not the individual one, right, which was already built in our model, but on the system level. And that also didn't have an effect. And we also thought, and that was actually one of the reviewers of the paper that suggested that perhaps this effect differ depending on when did the elections happen and how much time has passed since the last elections, because the data is not, it's collected in some period and not all countries have elections at the same time. But that actually didn't have an effect that was predicted. So these effects did not get smaller. If anything, they got larger over time. Right, so this gap between winners and losers. So that was, again, something we did not hypothesize. We don't want to make a big deal out of it, but we tested to check the robustness of our effects with that suggestion. Okay, so we have this story of observational data, and there is something to it that, if you lose elections, you are more vigilant about the checks and balances. At least you are more vigilant than those whose supported party won. But we wanted to probe further the causal relation. And this is where it all gets even more difficult, because you want to really find out whether this effect is due to winning or losing elections. And you have to manipulate that in the minds of citizens, right? And it's very, very tough to think experimentally about it. So we designed an experiment to test how citizens react to a reform of checks and balances, with the focus on one of the reforms that is actually happening in Poland, and I think also in Ukraine, and that's the appointment of judges. So the courts as a check. And here we have another set of hypotheses. It's pretty much aligning with the reasoning that I presented to you, but I would just spell them out as they were in the pre-registration of the experiment. We have like two sides of the same coin. First, we focus on the winner's consent. So we say that citizens are more likely to support and trust incumbents that infringe or reform democratic checks and balances, find these reforms justified and acceptable, vote for that party in the government when these reforms are implemented by a government party they support. So quite straightforward. And then the other side of the coin is the loser's dissent. And here we say that citizens are less likely to support and trust incumbents that infringe on democratic checks and balances, that to find the reforms justified and acceptable, and vote for the party in the future when these reforms are implemented by a government party they oppose. And then we have one about economy, exactly the same reasoning. So they are more likely to endorse this government and the reform when the economic performance is perceived as better than that of the previous government. And then how do we do it? I don't know how much experience you have with survey experiments. Maybe some of you at least read papers that use survey experiments, some maybe already conducted experiments. If you are having to do with economy, probably you run economic games as your main experiments. But this is just the pretty standard way to execute it with a vignette that we show participants. And how we did it here was that we assigned each participant randomly to see one version of the story, which means it was a between subject design. And what we varied in these stories is the partisanship. So whether just some party won elections, the party that you support or the party that you oppose won elections. And we varied how well the government was performing economically. So either the performance was the same as before or it was improved. And I will just read you out the story so that you can kind of envision it. A participant reads that we ask them to imagine that one of the political parties in your country, or in another version of reality, the political party that you support or the political party that you oppose, wins the majority at a fully competitive and fair election. This means that the party gets to form the government and implement various policies. Under this government, the levels of income of most citizens remained the same as under or increased by comparison to the levels achieved by the previous government, right? So here, this is the experimental manipulation. And then everybody reads the same text. The government starts implementing a reform that makes changes to the way judges are appointed and dismissed, which was not a part of the party program. To pass the reform, the government needs to change the constitution, and the government claims that this reform is needed to get rid of the corrupt judges that were working for the previous government. Or regime, I think it was in the translation in Ukrainian. So I want to point you to a couple of things here that we were trying to do, and I'm not sure whether we were completely successful at doing. So first of all, we wanted to make this story ecologically valid. And that's why we have this kind of justification in terms of, we are actually trying to do a good thing. We are trying to get rid of a corrupt government. And I think this is more ecologically valid, at least in the societies that we are dealing with, than just saying, I'm just not going to listen to the courts. I want to destroy democracy. And this is very often how it's being manipulated in these other experiments. So, for example, this paper of Graham and Sfolik, they just have simply profiles of politicians who say, we will not listen to the courts. We will always listen to the courts, right? And I think this is not really how it works, at least when I observe the political debate. My hunch is that these politicians that are starting reforms like that, they always say, this is for democracy. This is for, actually getting rid of corruption and making things better, no matter from which side of the political spectrum they are. So that's why we arrived at this kind of text. In future studies, we simplify it a little bit, but our reviewers were a little bit confused. But I also don't know how much they know about this context. So it might be that for them, it sounds weird because it's not something that happens in the political debates in their countries. And then we have the outcome variables measures, right? So we asked about the extent of support that participants would give to this government, trust, whether they would think that this decision to reform is justified, acceptable, and then whether they would vote for this kind of government in the future. And these are the results. Again, I will just talk you through very slowly, step by step. So here you just see the results across all experimental conditions. So here, first of all, here you have the conditions where the economy was the same as before, so stable. And here you have the conditions where economy improves, right? And at the bottom, you see that this is when you were in oppose, the party that you opposed won, in neutral condition, or the party that you supported won. And the same is here for these three half violin plots. So on the left, you see then the three half violin plots that show the effect of coalition on the approval of the reform and the government under the stable economic conditions. So these three. On the right, you see them for the economy improved. And the important thing then to note is that all these three medians are lower when the economy is stable than when economy improves, right? So we have this main effect of the economy. If economy improved, then you approved of this reform and this government more. That's the conclusion from that. And then the other thing that we want to note here is that we also see that the bars in both red half violins, so this one and this one, are lower than the bars in blue, in also across the economic conditions. So it means what we find here is that those who were in the opposed conditions, so they opposed the government that was in charge, they were less approving of that reform and that government. So we have again sort of evidence that it's the losers that are different, because the supporters and the neutrals, they are not always significantly different, but those who were on the losing side, they are always standing out. So this was, well, the study, and our conclusions were that supporting a losing party is associated with higher importance assigned to checks and balances, and the supporters of the losing parties are different from the rest. This is from the Observational Study, and that satisfaction with the economy is associated with lower importance assigned to checks and balances. So we are willing to trade off some of the checks and balances for economic gains. And then from the experiment, our conclusion is that participants cued that the reforms of checks and balances are done by parties they opposed at the election are more negative about these reforms and about the governments that introduced them. Again, the losers were the ones who were different, and improved economic performance increases support for the reform of checks and balances and those governments that are conducting it. I think now I still have about 10 minutes to take you to the next step. I think I've been talking maybe for 30 minutes now, right? So of course, as any study, we've been already thinking about the limitations, and it's been, you know, pointed out to us in the review process what's wrong with, potentially wrong, or what we have to still strengthen in our argument. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is, are these effects of partisanship and economy specific to the reforms of checks and balances, or would we find them with any reform, right? So is there something special about checks and balances? So further evidence is needed that these effects are driven by the losers' increased vigilance towards checks and balances. And of course, what about different checks and balances? So here in the experiment, we only focused on this reform of courts and the judicial system, but there are other checks and balances too. How far can we generalize from that? So I've started already an extension of this study. In the first step, I conducted a pilot with students, and I will show you like very preliminary results of that pilot. And I now have almost concluded data collection in Poland. And in this study, I changed a little bit the narrative, and I focus on what motivations citizens assign to the reformers, depending on their coalitional association. So it's still a very similar argument, but it's more about, you know, this kind of motivated reasoning literature that when it's someone from the opposing coalition that is making a decision, we interpret it differently than when it's someone from our coalition. So do citizens attribute different motivations to reformers of checks and balances depending on their coalitional status? And do evaluations of motivations for reforms of checks and balances differ from evaluations of other reforms? So this is also another fix that I'm trying to apply in this next study. And because of that, I have now a little bit more complicated design. I have a between and within subject design. And I manipulate between just the coalition, and it's done pretty much the same as in this study with the Ukrainian sample. So either you are in a neutral political party condition, or the political party you support and feel very close to wins, or the political party that you oppose and do not feel close to at all wins. So you see that I here also already added a little bit of the manipulation to make people imagine that they really feel strongly about this political party, which we didn't have in the first study. And I streamlined the text a little bit of this manipulation. And now the next steps are that this means that the party gets to form the government and implement various policies. One of the minister proposes to introduce a new law for registration of protests. So here, that's the different reform. As a result, it will be more difficult to organize a protest, but the minister informs that this reform is needed to assure safety of citizen gatherings. The government supports this plan. So you actually now have, you can go in any way in interpreting this reform. We don't have this constitutionality anymore that they have to change the constitution, but it's still with an argument that they are doing it out of good intentions, right? At least that's the claim of the minister. And within subjects, people in the final study, let's say, so not in the pilot, see 3 different checks and balances reforms, and one reform that has nothing to do with checks and balances. And I tried to come up with the least political, like ideologically kind of placed reform that I could come up with, and that was a change of the tax statement deadline. When you have to report your income to the government, it seems like something that doesn't have a lot of political connotation in it. So this would be the same setup, right? And participant would always be in the same coalition condition, but then they would evaluate 3 vignettes about checks and balances and 1 about this submitting tax statements deadline. And here I use the Polish deadlines, so because the sample now is collected in Poland, that it will be moved from the 1st of May to 1st of June. So, can you assign still bad motivations to this kind of reform? Let's see. And then the dependent variable is operationalized slightly differently. I asked, in your opinion, what is the most likely motivation of this government to introduce such a reform? And then I have 2 sort of benign motivations, one specific to assure the protests are peaceful and safe, second one more general to strengthen democracy, and then the malicious intentions to have fewer limitations on the power of the government so they can do whatever they want and to undermine democracy. And of course, the phrasing has to be slightly different for all the different checks and balances and this tax reform, but they follow the same logic. So one specific kind of intention and one more general. And these are the preliminary results. So bear in mind, I have only 205 participants here, and they are students. So, this is a different kind of sample, but still what we see is that this is the benign reform dependent variable, and this is the malicious reform dependent variable, right? What we see is that those participants who were in the opposition condition, so party they oppose one, assigned significantly less benign, so good intentions to the reforms. So these are those participants, because here the means are a little bit higher. And this is still significant. I know you probably cannot see it from these bars, but just you have to trust me on this one. And those participants who were in the support condition assigned significantly less malicious intentions. So this is this one, right? So it's a bit lower than these 2, the median. So yeah, we just think differently about the reforms depending on who makes them. And then sometimes we assign more malicious and sometimes we assign more benign intentions, right? So we have some more favorable views. That's at least from the pilot. I don't know if I'll find it in the Polish sample. What is interesting though here you see the, not the checks and balances reform, but the tax reform. And you see that pretty much across the conditions they're aligned. So there is no differences detected between the conditions. So it looks like people really have this on button for, okay, someone is changing checks and balances, right? That something in the system will be changed. Our rights might be curtailed. And then these motivations actually work because there is much more discrepancy in the evaluations. When it's just a tax reform deadline, the tax deadline for the statement for your income tax, then yeah, it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't activate that kind of coalitional thinking, which gives me hope that there is something about this, this checks and balances theory that that we are onto. So I have collected now the data from Poland. I'm having some problems with the survey company that I'm using for this data collection, so I will not mention their name. But we will have around 1,000 participants from that sample. Also, it will be a quoted sample, so it is meant to represent the Polish population, at least urban one. And we have this form with 4 reforms there, all tested. Yeah, I look forward to finding out what's in the Polish data. So thank you so much. I'm happy to discuss any of this or any of the other projects with you, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. This was quite a lot of different data with quite interesting results. So since the audience, I guess, need to warm up and think a bit about the questions, I will just ask a few technical questions, and I will give time to our students to think about what they want to ask. Yeah, you mentioned that you worked with InfoSapiens, and of course, they're very famous organization in Ukraine with an established reputation. But can you tell us a bit more about the vignette itself, and how you recruited the respondents, how many respondents you had, because you did not mention these technical details on the slide, but maybe you can just elaborate on the process. Was it the online recruitment system or any other mode of working with respondents, and what did you control and what you did not control in your research? Okay, I think, Ghonorata, you're back.
I'm back. I don't know why I got thrown out, but I missed your question completely. I dropped at so I worked with InfoSapiens. That was the
that's good, because now I can I have a second chance to phrase it better. So that's
all right.
It's a very nice coincidence. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the technicalities of the survey experiment. You did not mention these details on the slide, but maybe you can elaborate on how many people you recruited, what kind of sample it was, whether it was online recruitment or not. I think our students will be happy to learn about this methodology and how to manage these kinds of studies.
Yes, it's extremely important, of course, to know then how far can we extrapolate to the general population, right? So InfoSapiens has access to, I think, settlements of 50,000 plus of people, and so cities and bigger towns in Ukraine. So they cannot really sample more rural areas. So this is really an urban population. The age, I think, was between 18 and 55, if I remember correctly. And this is also because in the end, when you think about the fact, and you pointed it out, that it was done online, if we had older population, then these people in the sample that were older would not be representative of a general older sample, general population in Ukraine, right? Because it's rather rare that, a 70-year-old person uses internet, mobile to go online and fill in service. So this is a special person then that we would have in a sample. So that was the kind of restriction within which we worked. And then what they do, they use quota samples. So they try to represent the population of Ukraine in terms of age, education level, and I think gender were the 3 quotas that we had there. And they send us also actually a correction. So we applied, a weight for our data so that it does represent at least this restricted sample that we had. So 18 to 55 years old, and then in terms of these 3 characteristics. And I think our sample was around 500, if I remember correctly. I should just have it somewhere in, I think 577. So we planned for 500 and we got a little bit more for free. So that was nice.
Yeah. Good bargain. And I wonder, besides the experiment, besides the vignette, did you ask any other questions in the survey? Perhaps I was just wondering if you were able to control for the party which they actually supported, or maybe for the ideological background of these respondents.
Yeah. So we do have this information, if not in the main text, then we have it in the supplement. And we did look at all kinds of distributions. So in general, we were also interested whether these people answered that they care about democracy, that they care about the courts, that they care about all kinds of checks and balances. And the distribution for which party they voted for was actually also pretty good. So we had both, the party in government, the opposition, the old party of the government, etc. So there was quite good distribution. And what we did not plan was to look for interaction effects between, your party identity and then the treatment that we applied. So the, the experiment, because in principle, how we phrased the experiment was supposed to speak to anybody, right? Even if you were now in government in your own country, you were asked to imagine that you aren't in particular condition. So the good thing about experiments here is that because of the random assignment, you should have the same mix of voters for, the opposition bloc and voters for Zelensky in your one condition, and the same kind of mix in the other conditions. So that should not play a role technically, unless you have some systematic mistake, systematic bias in sampling, that more of that party got into one condition but not in the other. But in general, we were not worried about that because we were trying to find this effect beyond these political divisions that exist in the country. And I think it is also sort of in line with the findings from even the studies of Republicans and Democrats, that this kind of explanation, coalitional explanation, it applies to both sides. So it's not that one is more guilty than the other. Probably objectively what happens to the political system under one party versus the other is something else. But if you think about the kind of underlying psychology, that's a different story, huh? Yeah, and
thanks. And another question I have is more kind of invitation to have some maybe speculative conversation, because the question I'm going to ask is very broad, and I'm just interested in your opinion. Well, I liked your presentation also because you mentioned this idea of motivated reasoning and all the literature about motivated reasoning. And when I usually read papers like yours, a lot of people engage with another literature, which is more about in-group, out-group, social identity theories. And the idea there is that, well, somehow respondents categorize others. They categorize them as in-group or out-group, and then they behave based on this categorization. And then the next step in this literature is to blame political parties or political leaders, to say that political leaders, they use official channels or unions or social media, basically to kind of fuel in-group and out-group categorization. But your research shows, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like you don't need a party to influence you. You just must have this feeling that I'm a loser, that my party lost. I don't need anyone to remind me that or send me outrageous social media posts about it or something like that. You need a very little nudge, a very tiny nudge to fuel this motivating reasoning. So I guess my question is very broad, but can you somehow react to this observation? Do you agree with my interpretation or not? To what extent you oppose your findings against in-group, out-group, or balance it with this theory?
I don't necessarily think that they are opposed. I think that there are just different layers of explanations. So I think what you pointed correctly is that my assumption is that there is just something at the bottom that motivates us, right? And then if you have a discourse that even encourages it further, and maybe polarizing discourse, that can then scale up to even larger conflict in society. And I think this is where they are right. They are warning about, I don't know whether it's correct because they might be overestimating the role of social media, etc. But any kind of polarizing activities and discourse, even if you think about policy making, right? If you consistently exclude one group from particular benefits and privilege others, this is also polarizing society. So you don't even need discourse. You can just do action as a politician to create these groups and to create these oppositions. So I think in that sense, I go a little bit more to the bottom of it, right? That this coalitional thinking is there and it can be easily sparked, and then they go and build up on that. Well, especially if you start creating all kinds of opposing identities and social constructs, that are in conflict, then you might have a larger conflict in society. Yeah. And I think I have actually one study, again with Ukrainian data for that matter, which is about belief in and spreading of fake news. It is not studying of real fake news behavior on social media, but it is again in a survey experiment design, hypothetical. And what we did in that study was that we wanted to see whether beyond identities, Russia versus the EU, which is the common identity assigned to the region with which we are dealing, actually the conflict perceptions between your country and either the EU or Russia motivates this belief in fake news and makes people more willing to spread it. And we find that indeed this is the case. So if you think that you are really in a conflict, in a kind of zero-sum game, with the EU as a Ukrainian person, then you will you would just endorse fake news, fake information that is negative about the EU. If you, on the other hand, believe that Russia is the adversary of Ukraine and there is this zero-sum game, if Russia wins, we lose, then you endorse all the negative news about Russia. And this was beyond, the standard measures of identity. So like, do you identify yourself with Russia or do you identify yourself with Europe, right? And that was really interesting for us because it really builds also, again, above this motivated reasoning literature, which focuses mainly on this party identity or just identification. And I always keep repeating it as an example. I have a very good friend at work who is Lithuanian. And, by default, we might need to be enemies, right? Poland, Lithuania, the, great Polish-Lithuanian kingdom story. And I just tell her, look, we have different identities, but there is absolutely no conflict perception in our existence. So I do not buy into rumors that are being spread about you, right? That's the kind of mechanism. So there needs to be something more than just identity to do that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And also kind of short reaction to what you just said, because you emphasized this, that the respondents, they must have some stake in this zero-sum game. And you also mentioned it when you presented the slides from the European Social Survey. I was just thinking that perhaps yet another hypothetical explanation of this variation could be that the institutional system, how the country is organized, whether they have the very strong centralized system versus decentralization, because I imagine that especially now in Ukraine, we can expect some changes due to the reform of decentralization, meaning that now more and more people, they now receive this increasing autonomy in their local communities, meaning that perhaps if somewhere in the central government, some bad party comes to power, it does not necessarily affect your policy outcomes, because you live in your community, and in your community you have more power to influence policies and maybe even stronger local identity. So I wonder whether this logic could be applied to European countries where, the Netherlands, I think, is more centralized and Germany has more decentralized system. Do you think it it kind of have some potential effect?
Yeah, it could, and I think then the conflicts might be different, huh? So what we have conflicts about might be different on the local level and on the national level. And I think for my studies, it really matters for this broader project also, what is your distance from the person that takes decisions for you? Because those who are in the local community, they are actually embedded much more, and they are also more exposed. Their actions are more visible, right? So it's really hard to hide if you are in a very small community as a politician transgressing. Whereas when you are at the top, well, first of all, probably you have a tougher time showing that you are actually doing something, because, well, if you are not the one that is constantly on TV, then yeah, there is really little attention to what you are doing. So you can't gain the trust. But also, I think the default is distrust, right? So whatever bad action you are doing, it's going to weigh much more negatively for you over there. But you know, we also have this evidence from this study actually by Graham and Spolik that what kind of transgressions people pay attention to is sometimes surprising. So I think they paid even more attention to, for example, extramarital affairs of politicians when picking one or the other than some outcomes or some checks and balances issues, right? So I don't know. I don't know how that then will play in this local versus national level. I think scandals play a big role in politics anywhere, I guess. So it's difficult to say how this will play out. Wouter Veenendaal, who is with me on the project, and this might be interesting for some of you who really want to look at this decentralization as an issue, looks at that issue in his project, I think on local versus national politics, because he's also really preoccupied with small states and small communities. So he will look how that works in, you know, even just here at the level of provinces and local governments in the Netherlands. But yeah, I think it's actually fascinating, the case of Ukraine at the moment, because what is, well, it's fascinating that it's all happening, that decentralization happens, the state level public administration is being reformed, right? So many things happen. On the other hand, it's super tricky for a researcher to then isolate the effects somehow of what's going on. That's why I tend to go then more for the individual level, because there it's easier to isolate them. On the kind of state level, it becomes already problematic when so many things are changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to give another chance to our students to ask their questions. If someone wants to ask a question, you can just unmute yourself or type the question in the chat. I'm watching the Facebook streaming as well, and I see that actually people who work in InfoSapiens, they also just commented, and yeah, so they're also
I did not
watching.
expect that.
Yeah, but it's just a polite comment that it was an online panel, and yeah, so I don't see questions, so I guess it's a good time to wrap up our meeting and to applaud virtually to Ghonorata for her presentation in the evening. Thank you very much for spending your evening time and dedicating your time to presenting your research to our audience. I hope we can invite you more, and we are definitely looking forward to read more of your papers about Ukraine or European politics.
Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, they appear, you know, later on. Please feel free to contact me. You can find me on the Leiden University website and send any questions. I'll be happy to respond. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.